everyone, for disclosure purposes, I will put up Pradipika's description.
But in football games, we have some shows, right? When there is a break, halftime break. Should we invite Yogesh to perform the halftime?
We'll need a crew.
True. Okay. Well, it went so well so far. I think it went well, and there were a lot of enthusiastic questions. That shows that people really paying attention.
I think there is a question asking if they have an option to change the breakout room. The answer is yes. You can switch between the breakout rooms whenever you would like to. So that option remains with you. It's open.
How do we do that?
I think you can just say leave room or move to breakout.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. I think, Darshan, you need to switch your displays.
Yeah, when I said leave, it says only to leave. It didn't give me that option, but maybe that will give me the option later.
Should I already test my slides to see that it shows up okay? I see Darshan nodding yes.
Yes.
Do you see it full screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Just stop for now.
So just so to let people know, when you click on the breakout room on the bottom and you hover over your name, it can say move to or something like that. So then you can move to the other breakout room.
Okay, great.
Hi, Satbir. You wanted to test your slides?
Yep.
Putting the schedule right so that people can see what's coming up.
Perfect. Okay. Hello, Sangsrema. Good to see you.
I've been just hiding behind my camera, but
You want to just check your slides real quick while we're just
sure.
Satbir will go first, and then maybe followed him.
Is that working?
Yeah, and then just let me see. Perfect. Good. Awesome. Okay. Excellent.
This has been great so far.
Well, so we'll just start and just we'll give people just a couple of minutes as people kind of recalibrate themselves between the two rooms.
Which is on yogic diet and fasting, as well as Buddhist contributions, can move to breakout session 2. But if you want to stay in breakout session 1 on circadian rhythms, you can stay here in the same session.
Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give people just a few more minutes as they're kind of recalibrating which breakout they'd like to be in. And but we'll get started here in just a couple of minutes as people get together.
Once again, I think there is a question on how to be joined the breakout section 2. You should be able to see a breakout icon on your YouTube link at the bottom. You should be able to say, move me to breakout session 2. I think Kushi has written down how to do it. Thank you, Kushi.
Hi.
I found the easy way to join the other breakout session is just to click on the breakout session and scroll down to the bottom, towards bottom.
We haven't started yet. We'll get started in just a moment.
Your name or something. If you just click on the breakout session and scroll down to the bottom, you will see the breakout session section 2, and then all you have to do is say join. So if you want to go there, you can just go there.
Hey. I'm just going to get started in just a moment here as people join. Again, as we have this discussion, we'll invite you to put questions again in the chat for our speakers, and we're going to have a time for question and answer. Q&A, sort of a discussion at the end. So both presenters will give some comments, and then we'll have time for some Q&A. So there will be engaged discussion with all of us together. So, what?
Dr. Matson indicated that Johns Hopkins students get education on fasting.
Yeah.
Well, the Harvard Medical students get education on yoga and mind-body medicine. So as usual, Harvard Medical School is ahead of Johns Hopkins.
That's good. All right. Well, why don't we let's go ahead and get started. On that note, so it is my really my honor to present my friend and colleague, Dr. Satvir Singh Khalsa. Dr. Khalsa is director of yoga research for the Yoga Alliance and Kundalini Research Institute Research Associate at the Benson Henry Institute for Mind Body Medicine and Research Affiliate for the Osher Center for Integrative Medicine, and Assistant Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School at Brigham Women's Hospital. His research has evaluated yoga for insomnia, stress, anxiety-related disorders in workplace and public school settings, and works with the International Association of Yoga Therapists as a scientific director for the annual Symposium on Yoga Research, and is editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Yoga Therapy, and recently published a landmark paper in JAMA on looking at yoga in the treatment of anxiety. So with that, Satvir, please take it away.
Thanks very much, Darshan, and I very much appreciate the organizers inviting me to participate, although I have to admit I'm not an expert in fasting, but I think over the past 2 weeks I've become an expert. So I'm hoping to share with you sort of a yogic perspective in terms of where fasting does and may fit into yoga practice. So the way you see yoga practice mostly practiced in modern times is with a combination in its multi-component manifestation as the physical postures and exercises you see, or breathing techniques, deep relaxation, and meditation. And most of these really take up most of what are referred to as the 8 limbs of yoga, the central practice. And this is the way it's traditionally practiced, the core practices, I would say. However, many people are practicing just the postures and exercises, which is a limited form of yoga practice. Now, we have a lot of information about, the underlying psychophysiology about how yoga practices work. Some of the early studies looked at advanced yoga practitioners and found that after studying them, that physiologically yogic meditation represents deep relaxation of the autonomic nervous system, which highlights a central construct in the field of yoga and of mind-body medicine. That is the idea of self-regulation of internal state, the ability to control internal mental and emotional functioning as well as physiological functioning through these training practices that we have in yoga. And we can summarize all of this in this logic model. So yoga in its traditional form is these 4 components: postures, breathing, relaxation, meditation. We're affecting a physical body with the asanas, the physical practices, the breathing techniques, improving physiological and anatomical functioning. It's largely through all of these components that we're engaging in this self-regulation of internal state. The most important ones are stress and emotion regulation, which leads to resilience and equanimity. It's largely through the meditative component of yoga practice by engaging the attention networks in the practice of meditation, which is the non-analytical, relaxed focus of attention, that we're increasing what we call mind-body awareness, also known as mindfulness, which improves central brain functioning, concentration, cognition, and ultimately leads to a state we call metacognition, the ability to self-regulate one's own thought processes, reactions to one's own thoughts, and even change thought processes. And then over time, historically, the goal of meditation was to produce these deep unitive transcendent states. And the idea in yoga is that you manifest perfection in the function of all of the other aspects of the mind and body, which then enables those regions in the central nervous system
This meeting is being recorded.
to express these deeper transcendental type experiences. So this is really sort of the core of what yoga is. Now, many people will practice all of this and achieve all of these positive functions and improve global human functionality. However, many people go on beyond that and practice additional elements of yoga practice in terms of practicing regularly. There's another one of the 8 limbs called the yamas and niyamas, which are recommendations for ethical behavior. People can practice mantras. There's a whole philosophy and psychology involved with yoga. People can move into a community. People can adopt a diet, and the primary diet in yoga practice, at least certainly in India, is the lacto-vegetarian diet. There are in many yoga traditions and yoga schools regimens for fasting and monodiets. And then there's also energetic medicine, a psychic anatomy, talking about these energies like prana and kundalini. Now, and when we talk about the yamas, these are positive attributes or positive disciplines, and the 5 that are usually listed for yoga are the top 5 here. However, in Indian culture and history, there's another 5 here, and the last one here is actually mitahara, which is moderation in diet. When we look at the niyamas, there's an interesting one here called tapas, which refers to austerity, sort of the manipulation of the body and the mind in terms of discipline. And tapas is the 3rd component of niyama. It comprises such practices as prolonged immobilized standing or sitting, the bearing of hunger, that ties into eating behavior, thirst, cold, heat, formal silence, and fasting. The fruit of such asceticism is the perfection of the body, which becomes robust like a diamond. So what we're talking about here is the development of psychological and physical resilience. Tapas must not be confused with harmful self-castigation and facuristic self-torture, however. And this is important because there are sects of yoga practitioners and fakirs historically in India who practiced a good deal of self-mortification and self-flagellation as part of their discipline. But here, tapas is free from that in this particular author's writing. From another author, tapas translated austerity, self-discipline, or purification consists in endurance of pairs of opposites such as heat and cold and the desire to eat. Tapas involves fasting and observance of various vows, such as the vow of silence. It ordinarily involves self-discipline of the physical body with the intention of weakening the association of the physical body with consciousness, making possible an awareness of the body as not self. Tapas represents practices that not only remove impurities, this is another feature, but contribute to endurance and non-susceptibility to help make the body-mind a fit vehicle for the spiritual journey. So this is, as I presented in the logic model, we're talking about development of purification, we're talking about development of resilience. And from this author, tapas, which is obtained through fasting, through vigil kept in the presence of fire, etc., is also obtained by holding the breath. Now we can look at some of the ancient yogic texts and see what is in them. In the sort of the cardinal yogic text, which is Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, there's very little about even the postures, and there's nothing about eating or dietary behavior. But moving forward in time, this is the oldest other text that is a common text, the Gheranda Samhita. He who practices this kind of yoga should be celibate and a renouncer, living on a modest diet. He will become an adept after a year. There should be no doubt about this. And then in another stanza, he who consumes oil-rich and sweet food, delighting in its taste and leaving a fourth part, is called a modest eater. And I think Dr. Lad even referred to this whole idea of filling the stomach to certain levels. Yoga removes the suffering of him who is yoked, disciplined in eating and fasting, yoked in the performance of actions, and yoked in sleeping and waking. So this whole idea of discipline, self-regulation of diet is one aspect that comes out in these texts. In the Shiva Samhita, the yoga should renounce the following: fasting, and lastly, much eating. So on the extremes, basically what this is saying is to avoid the extremes, to avoid the self-flagellation and the self-mortification, the austerity component. The following are obstacles which Dharma interposes: vows and penances, fasts, religious observances, silence, the ascetic practices, vows of starvation. So very much these texts are talking about moderation. Those who are moderate in their diet, rulers of their senses, and are the practitioners of every kind of yoga, undoubtedly they obtain success in 3 years. They are entitled to be initiated in all kinds of yoga without any hesitation. Moving on to the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, the yoga forces are dissipated by too much eating, heavy physical labor, too much talk, observances of ascetic vows, promiscuous company, and a growling stomach, which refers to too much fasting, not eating enough. The brahmacharin who, observing moderate diet, renouncing the fruits of his actions, practices Hatha Yoga will become a siddha in the span of 1 year. Moderate diet means pleasant, sweet food, leaving free 1/4 of the stomach. The act of eating is dedicated to Shiva. The following are considered as not being salutary, and it lists all kinds of foods that yogis should and should not eat, and this varies from text to text. It is also advisable to avoid reheated food, an excess of salt or acid, foods that are hard to digest or are woody. Goraksha teaches that in the beginning, the yogis should avoid bad company, proximity to fire, sexual relations, long trips, cold baths in the early morning, and there is fasting. Now, finally, in the Gheranda Samhita, he who begins the practice of yoga without controlling his diet suffers from many diseases and does not make progress in yoga. They call that mitahara, controlled diet, which is pure, sweet, lubricated, and fills only half the stomach, which is palatable and eaten to please God in oneself. One should fill half the stomach with food, 1/4 with water, and the 4th quarter should be reserved for the movement of air. And if you heard Dr. Lad's presentation, this is apparently coming directly from the Ayurvedic text as well. He should avoid early morning bath, fasting, etc., or anything that causes fatigue. Similarly, he should avoid eating once a day or not eating at all, or eating again within 3 hours. In the beginning, he should take milk and ghee daily and his food twice a day, once at noon and once in the evening. So these prescriptions vary, but the whole idea is really self-regulation of dietary intake. Now, it's interesting to look at some of the sects in India, especially those that went into some degree of ascetic practices. And this is a text that was published in 1983 on the Gorakhnath lineage of yoga practice. And in this text, he is dissuaded from becoming a yogi, the guru pointing out to him the hardships that his initiation in his life as a yogi would entail. This is for someone who's trying to join the sect. When the guru is satisfied with the self-control and resolution shown by the candidate, a fast of 2 or 3 days may be prescribed. Gorakhnathis recognize also the feasts of Shivratri. The 13th of the light half of each lunar month is sacred to Shiva, and he is worshipped at sunset, a fast being kept until the stars appear. The fast for the Shivratri lasts for 24 hours. The worshipper abstains from food and drink during the day. A fast is kept from noon on the 4th of Shravana, and the worshipper bathes at dawn on the 5th. And then finally, fasts, mortifications, and ascetic disciplines generally fall within the province of yoga practice. Bodily discipline became a means to further mental control. Again, this whole construct of self-regulation. Both Jains and Buddhists witness to the practice of yoga, which, however, antedates them both. And then there's this book, there's this article that was published on the history of Indian diet and food intake. The fourth part of one's life was spent as a wandering ascetic, also known as sannyasi or yogi. Both men and women followed the same lifestyle of endless fasting, eating only if and when a householder gave them some food. They abstained from meat and fish consumption and sexual activity, nor did they save the leftovers. And then there's the quote from a king in India, Mangarasa, who ruled from Kalayali in Karnataka. And he wrote, "The one who takes food only once in a day is a yogi." Again, this parallels what Dr. Lad was talking about. And again, it's likely that this maybe is a crossover from Ayurveda. He is equivalent to God. The one who takes food twice a day is considered to be a common man. The one who eats 3 times a day suffers from diseases and is akin to a demon. Eating 4 times is considered still more evil. Although India has turned off the road to moksha, the conquest of senses continues to play an important role. That is, training the mind and body to control food cravings. The layman's understanding of the word hunger, experienced in the pit of the stomach or hypoglycemic irritability. The ancient techniques of meditation and yoga, besides the hormonal adjustments in response to the ancient dietary style, can be adopted to address this need. And again, we're talking about this whole idea of self-regulation of cravings. Now, you'll see actually fasting referred to in many yogic books, and this is just one that I happened to come across and was able to get a quote from. This is written by an Indian author. So this is a book on Hatha yoga for the general public. Fasting was prescribed as a universal remedy in ancient times. Langanam Paramusadam, said the Ayurvedic doctors. A fast every week or fortnight gives the digestive system a much-needed rest. So this is another construct we're talking about in fasting, this whole idea of a rest for the system. At the same time, it gives the body a chance to cleanse itself of accumulated toxins. Again, this is a whole construct of purification. Plenty of water must be taken during a fast. It flushes the system of obstinate waste matter and prevents excessive acidity in the stomach. And in another quote, you can set aside a particular day at regular intervals of times for a fast. It can be a total fast when you eat or drink nothing except plain water. Or you can take only liquids such as buttermilk, milk, and fruit juice. So this whole idea of fasting at regular intervals is really referring to intermittent fasting. Now finally, you'll mostly find in modern yoga practice these fasting regimens or recommendations are usually in yoga lineages that have begun by a yoga master or a yoga teacher. And I'm just going to show you 2 of the examples of this. One is from the Shivananda yoga lineage, started by Swami Shivananda in India, and then his disciples, including Vishnu Devananda and others who now practice in the Shivananda tradition. So this is a book published by the Shivananda Yoga Center. And in this book, although it's about yoga, there's a whole section on fasting. Yogis fast mainly to bring the mind and senses under control, but also to cleanse and thus rejuvenate the body. Resting the digestive system releases energy for spiritual development and for spiritual healing, allowing the body to rid itself of toxins. On no account should fasting be confused with dieting. Its purpose is to purify the body and the mind, not to lose weight. A fast is a form of medicine in its own right. Fasting 1 day a week is good discipline to strengthen your willpower, but you will need more time if you want to detoxify the system. Fasts of 4 days can be safely undertaken without supervision, but not longer. Decide what kind of fast you are going to follow, water, fruit juice, or vegetable juice, and stick to it exclusively. And so this introduces the other construct of not just fasting on water, but also what we might call a mono diet, a single food or a single variety of foods that are taken on a regular basis. And then from the school of yoga that I practice, Kundalini Yoga, which was founded by Yogi Bhajan, and in the book that our organization put together, Foods for Health and Healing, there's a section on fasting. Fasting is more than just the absence of food. It's a very powerful tool in healing and strengthening the body. Very seldom is it recommended to fast on water only. It is a good thing to fast on water once a week, but rarely is it wise to do an extended water fast. Most of the time, it is better to go on a mono diet of those foods which possess the healing properties which the body needs. It is safer and often more effective. People who fast for the first time are often surprised to find that sticking to their diets is only half the challenge of fasting. Often the physical cleansing of fast is accompanied by a mental cleansing as well. And in this book, there's a whole list of different diets that you could practice, these mono diets with extensive instructions as to how to engage, what exactly you eat, what you don't eat, and how you come off of the fast, as are other books providing this kind of information. And I've actually practiced a number of these. I've practiced on many occasions the banana fast. This is a 3-week fast where you eat mostly nothing but bananas. And I've also done the fruit fast, which is 4 weeks of nothing but fruit. But there's very specific recommendations that you only eat one specific fruit at any meal. And I usually do this fruit fast once a year, and I find it's a really amazing experience because it changes your relationship to food in the sense of your body's needs and this whole idea of self-regulation that fits with the whole idea of yoga and its practices. So somewhat in summary, the major reasons why it's fasting and mono diets are included in yoga is really sort of optimizing health. So one construct is this whole idea of removing toxins, cleansing or detoxification. Although I have to admit, from a biomedical perspective, I'm not sure what toxins really refer to. And it's not been made clear to what these toxins are, but that is the language that's used in yoga practices when we talk about not just diet, but also yoga practices themselves. And then there's the whole idea of resting and rejuvenating the body, giving the digestive system a break, a rest, so that it can return to normal functioning. And then there's this whole idea of physical resilience, the idea of challenging the body and then coming back stronger. And this is a very core practice within yoga, the whole idea of doing these postures and breathing techniques to actually build physical resilience. And then self-regulation is a key element here. That refers to psychological resilience, the whole idea of putting yourself through a psychological challenge, which is the hunger and a fast, and being able to come out on the other end stronger for it. And then hunger and appetite control, that is a whole thing that comes out of mono diets and fasting as well. And then finally, as referred to in one of the texts, the whole idea of increasing awareness of self and identity. What is it that we are? Are we our bodies? Are we our minds? Are we our emotions? And, putting ourselves through a fast or a mono diet really challenges that whole idea of identifying who and what we are and what our capabilities are. So I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the Q&A session later on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Satyar, for again the really insightful comments and remarks. So yeah, why don't we again, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to invite you to put your question in the Q&A, and then we're going to have a discussion between our experts and luminaries at the after our next presentation. And I would like to now invite Dr. Samsrema Ujid and continue into the front here. Good. And so Dr. Ujid is assistant professor of Tibetan Buddhism at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Her main research focus is on the transnational, trans-regional, and cross-cultural aspects of Buddhism, lineage, translation, monastic, and reincarnation networks. identity in Tibet and Mongolia in the early modern period, with an emphasis on the contributions made by ethnically Mongolian monk scholars. And she's just invite her to really talk about fasting in the Buddhist traditions and thinking about how Buddhist contexts have informed fasting traditions in the past, and as it influences in the present, given popularity of mind-body practices that even Dr. Satir Khalsa mentioned that is happening in the present day as well. So, Dr. Ajit, please.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for organizing this amazing discussion and for inviting me to join. And it's a pleasure to be part of this very unique and interdisciplinary conversation about fasting and all the other aspects that go with it. So when it comes to the Buddhist tradition, evidence of the practice of fasting go right back to the Buddha himself as a propagator of the tradition. So in the title of the talk, we mentioned wellness, and in the Buddhist context, again, wellness is not so much about day-to-day mundane wellness. This wellness is really in the realm of the mind, in a spiritual context, and we'll see how that works in a moment. So, just a little bit of background. So the Buddha is a propagator of the Buddhist tradition, Buddha meaning the awakened one. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. He lived for 80 years, which is a considerable amount of time, especially back in the days, which was 500 BCE. And he actually passed away from food poisoning. And he awakened as a result of practice. And what he discovered, the Dharma, so the teachings of the Buddha, is not something that he created or discovered for the first time. It's believed to be the rule of how things are. It's the ultimate truth that exists and is true regardless of whether the Buddha came to be or not. So his life story, although it's much of a hagiography, it's a tool for Buddhists to understand and realize the Dharma that he left behind. So as for his life story, they generally are presented as the 12 deeds, and I'm not going to go through them all, but number 5, 6, 7, and 8 relate to the topic of fasting. So it's said that he was born as a prince and lived a life which really had the most luxuries that one can imagine in those times. And he spent the majority of his early adult life delighting in the company of royal consorts, enjoying all of the arts and sports and luxuries available to him. And then, based on a series of events that he encountered, he decided to renounce the mundane way of living. Following that, it's said that he practiced austerities for 6 years. And although it doesn't go into the texts that we have access to, don't go into detail what they are, fasting, as we'll see, is mentioned as one of those forms of austerities. After that, he proceeded to the foot of the Bodhi tree, and there, through meditation and really a mental practice, he became awakened and thus becoming the Buddha. So really going back to the Pali texts, we find the following reference to his own experiences of these austerities that he underwent. So, quote, in a woodland grove in Uruvilva, he resolved to strive earnestly to overcome attachment to sensual pleasures by the force of will. He reduced his food intake to a few drops of bean soup a day till he became so emaciated that he could hardly stand and his body hair fell out. At this point, he felt that it was not possible for anyone to go further on the path of asceticism and still live. Nevertheless, though he had developed clarity of mind and energy, his body and mind were too pained and untranquil for practice. He therefore abandoned his practice of harsh asceticism, which he had carried out for 6 years. ... So said that at this point, he thought, might there be another path to awakening? And he remembered meditative states that he had spontaneously entered throughout his 6 years of pursuing different practices. He recollected this state and decided to go his own way to the Bodhi tree, where he sat and meditated for a number of weeks. It's said that at this point, his fellow ascetics that he'd been practicing austerities with kind of shunned him and said, well, he's given up. However, he took some food and sustenance, and once he felt like he was in a state where he could actually carry on practicing and meditating, so quote, "So when I had taken solid food and regained strength, then, quite withdrawn from sensuality, withdrawn from unskillful mental qualities, I entered and remained in thee, and following are the 4 so-called jhanas, or meditative states of profound absorption, marked by stillness and concentration, in which the mind is able to become fully immersed and absorbed on the chosen object of attention." And this is what's called the cornerstone of Buddhist practice of right concentration. So the first jhana is represented by rapture and pleasure born from withdrawal, accompanied by directed thought and evaluation. The second stage is rapture and pleasure born of composure, unification of awareness free from directed thought and evaluation, or internal assurance. And the third is described as equanimous and mindful, and marked by a pleasant abiding. And the last is described as pure equanimity and mindfulness, neither pleasure nor pain, beyond all duality. And the pleasant feeling that arose in this way did not invade my mind or remain. So these are quotes from what's believed to be quotations from the Buddha himself, describing his realization of the true nature of everything, which is owed to stepping away from extremes. So we all often talk about the Buddhist path or the Buddhist tradition as the middle way. And it's a middle way not just in regard to being a middle way between different traditions that existed at the time, but also in regard to all of its ideas, concepts, and practice. So here, in regard to fasting, it's similar. So, just some Buddhism basics. The Buddhist tradition believes the universe to contain beings beyond our ability to comprehend. In this universe, gods are acceptable, but what's denied is the concept of monotheistic gods. Traditionally, taking refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha makes one a Buddhist, and more recently, belief in reincarnation has been marked by modern-day practitioners. It's a combination of understanding and realization, understanding through study and realization through practice, such as meditation. And there's a high emphasis on practice, which isn't just meditation, but also inclusive of physical practices, which we can relate to maybe forms of yoga and fasting, as we'll see a bit later on. And behind all of these practices is intention. So the intention of why one is doing these is important. So here, it's not so much for physical wellness, although physical wellness is often a result or side effect of these practices. But the intention is to really become liberated. In the earlier traditions, the goal is for self-liberation, to become awakened oneself. And in the later tradition, the Mahayana, the goal becomes to liberate all sentient beings by becoming awakened. So this is the intention that underlies all Buddhist practices, including the forms of fasting that have developed over the centuries. So the Buddhist path is often broken down into, or nutshelled into, what's known as the Eightfold Path. And that's broken down again into 3 sections. So right understanding, right aspiration in the realm of wisdom, right speech, right action, right livelihood in the realm of morality, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration in the realm of concentration. So it's not that any of these are paths to be practiced individually, but they really come together and should be taken together, practiced together in order to constitute what the Buddhist path is. So based on these 8 paths, then we have all of the precepts. So there's 5 basic precepts that are instructed to be followed by anyone who is a Buddhist, regardless of whether they are lay or monastics. And then there's a further 5 precepts which are added to the first 5 to form 10. And these are the 10 precepts taken by a novice who's ordaining to become part of the Buddhist monastic community, monks and nuns. As you can see, number 6 is abstaining from eating after midday until the following dawn. So if we kind of add up the numbers, then we could call this a form of intermittent fasting. So this is one of the best known training rules or precepts of the monks and nuns, not eating between midday and dawn. So during this period, it's an offense for them to even touch food, let alone eat it. And this period is known as the wrong time. So the precepts are taken by reciting the precepts in order. And it's seen to have a lot of advantages both for the monks and lay people who decide to partake in these precepts. So for the monastic community, because they have free time, it means thoughts are no longer concerned for food. There's a lightness of the body. And this lightness of the body and time is really for the purpose of creating a more suitable mental and physical state for study, meditation, and practice. And although breaking this is not included in the heavy offenses, this training rule cannot be broken by any monastic, since it's breaking off it is a break of discipline. It also implies giving way to craving, losing the spirit of renunciation, giving way to greed, and getting in the way of developing the mind and meditative states. So this right time is said to be when the day is light enough to see the lines on the palms of one's hand, and it ends at high noon. During this time, the monastics may eat once or twice. If they eat once, then they need to eat adequate quantity of food that's needed to last for the 24 hours. So then it becomes a 24-hour fast. Whereas if they eat twice, then the second meal is usually served about half an hour or 15 minutes before high noon, so that they're well finished before noon hits. Okay, so what does a daily schedule of the monastic look like? So this tradition is still carried out to the present day, mostly in Southeast Asia and places like Thailand and Sri Lanka and so forth. So the monastic would rise at 5 a.m. and this is then followed by a period of meditation and study. Then they'll take breakfast around 7 a.m. And after breakfast, then they go for the alms round, in which they go around and collect the food from people willing to donate food for their last meal of the day. When they return, it's a period of communal chanting or meditation. That's followed by a period of teachings from the elder, oh, there's a spelling mistake there, my apologies, from the elder teachers. And then they have their final meal before 12 p.m. After the meal, there's a siesta, and that's followed by more teachings. They're allowed to take a light tea or sometimes fruit juices, not sweet ideally, and then that's followed by more chanting and meditation and so forth until they go to sleep. So in Southeast Asia, there's another tradition known as a forest monks tradition. This is a much more dedicated form of monasticism that's really more focused on meditation and the path of insight. So these monks, they really remain in the monks, hence the name for their order, and most of their nights are spent meditating, and they only eat breakfast. So breakfast is eaten sometime between 5 and 7 a.m., often 7, and once they're finished with their food, then there's more meditation and chanting, and then they're allowed to take a siesta from 10 to 3 p.m. And this may seem long, but it's to make up for the fact that they spend most of their nights meditating, because the nighttime is seen to be more conductive towards a clearer mind. It's also dark, less distractions of sight and noise, and so forth. In the evening, there's teachings by the abbot or the other teachers, and then during the night, for as long as they can, they meditate until they go to sleep, which is accompanied by what's known as sleeping meditation. So here you can see that the fasting, or the intermittent fasting, is really for the sake of the practice rather than for health benefits for the monastics. So we have the 10 precepts. That's the novice precepts that a monk or nun takes when they join the Buddhist order. Aside from these, there's also what's known as the 8 precepts of Uposatha. Those who take these precepts are known as the Upasaka for the male and Upasika for the female. So these can be taken by any lay individual at any time in their lives. So it's kind of a play on the 10 precepts, and it makes 8. So along with the 5 basic Buddhist precepts, then we have the same 6th precept, which is not to eat food between noon and the following dawn. And some of them are combined, so not to sing, dance, or watch entertainments, and so forth. And the last one, not to sit or lie on a large or high seat or bed. So these precepts can be taken temporarily by lay individuals, and essentially what it creates is an opportunity for the lay community to experience the benefits of living a monastic lifestyle for a day or maybe a few more, especially on Buddhist festivals and holy days such as the day marking the Buddha's birth, awakening, and passing away, and other days, as we'll see in a moment. So these precepts for the laity especially are believed to have remedying effects for the natural obscurations of the mundane realm. So not to kill is the practice of kindness and compassion. Not to steal is a practice of generosity and renunciation. Not to engage in sexual intercourse, and here I made a mistake, I apologize. So for the laity, the third one would be not to engage in sexual misconduct rather than intercourse. Fully, that's for the monastics only. Number 4, not to speak lies is remedied by loving truth. And number 5, mindfulness and clear awareness is achieved by not taking intoxicants. So 6 to 8, they're all intended to remedy obsessive mundane activities such as greed, self-indulgence, developing diligence, developing discipline, and developing modesty, humility, and moderation. So for the lay individuals, there are suggested days of observance, and those fall on the 8th and the 15th of the lunar calendar, so on the waxing and waning moons. So these rules that they have to follow are similar to the initiate novices joining the monastic community, and it's intended to cleanse the defiled mind through the proper techniques. So again, it's really intended to purify the mind. So these days they also involve ritual cleansing, and they can also be observed by nuns, monks, as well as lay people. Okay, so precept number 6, not to eat food between noon and the following dawn. So from the Pali scriptures, from dawn to midday is called kala, proper time, or the time that Buddhas and Aryas, or the noble ones, take their meal. From midday to dawn of the following day is vikala, or the improper time for meals. Similarly, the time from dawn to midday is called the Purabhat kala. From midday to dusk is called the Pachabhata kala. One may eat as many times as necessary in the first period. From dusk to the next dawn is called rati, and the meals may not be taken at this time. This is the reason for the passage with the words to the effect that one refrains from eating at night. So that's the case of the early Buddhist tradition and as it's practiced in Southeast Asia. But fasting practices vary as much as there are Buddhist traditions around the world. So when we come to the Mahayana, or what's known as the Greater Vehicle, then we have slightly different versions of fasting practices. So we won't go into these in too much detail, but in Japan, what's known as Roku Sainichi, it's a 6-day of fasting. It follows the same principles of the Upasota. So again, the same 8 precepts are followed, and the fasting is intermittent. And it's really intended for the lay community, and they temporarily observe the monastic rules, thereby joining the monastic community. There's also this practice of self-mummifying monks, which is, I think, currently banned in Japan, but this is really for the monastic community, and won't go into that in too much detail now. In China, there's what's known as the Zai Jie, or Baguan Zai, and that is known as the Eightfold Path, again following the same eightfold precepts. However, here the avoidance of meat and fish is also involved. So we know the Chinese tradition has an emphasis on abstaining from eating meat and following a vegetarian diet for the monastics and for most Buddhists especially today. There's also a long fast that's observed only by monks called the Changzai, and that's normally practiced for the first half of the first, fifth, and 9th month of the year. In Korea, fasting is practiced as a supplement to Buddhist meditation. And in Tibet, Mongolia, Nepal, Bhutan, Ladakh, and Sikkim, which all follow what's known as the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there is a practice known as Nyungne. And that's the one I'll be talking about in a bit more detail for the remainder of my time. Oh, I'm running out of time. The fasting practice of Nyungne is a temporary vow. Again, there's 8 precepts, followed by the laity for 1 day. The practice Nyung literally means fasting, so it's remaining in a fast. So it's considered the tantric practice propagated in the 9th century by a Kashmiri nun. And the purpose of the practice is really to purify defilements and generate merit. I'll just skip through those now. The 8 precepts are very similar to the 8 precepts that we find in the original Uposatha days of observance. But one set of Nyungne consists of 2 days of practice, and the first day is preliminary, where one eats only 1 meal, and the second day is actual fasting, where there's complete fast from no meals or drinks, and one must also be silent. During this day, one has to carry out calm meditation, visualization meditation, and mantra recitations. And traditionally, these are the so-called 10 benefits of Nyungne, and those are: your body will always be free from disease, so here's the physicality comes in. You'll be fully guided by the awakened ones, who are the very nature of your own mind. You will come by wealth, food, property. Your enemies will be summoned and subdued. And the honest speech of hosts and rulers will inspire courage in you. Your body will not be harmed by poisons, epidemics, and epidemics will not harm you. Weapons won't harm you. You won't die by water or by fire, and you will not experience untimely death. So here's just the schedule of what such a fast looks like today. You can see this one is just from last year. And what's interesting is, over the last decades, Nyungne as a practice, Nyungne retreats have really exploded all over the Western world and Europe, and also in America. During the pandemic, there has been a number of them just done online. So it's really picking up, and maybe this is, due to also the popularity of fasting practices in this general society as a whole, due to all the research that we've just heard lots about. I just wanted to also mention that fasting is something that I've been really interested in practicing since 2012. So I do just fast, and then I kind of live intermittently fasting most days. But in regard to the Buddhist practice, as a practicing Buddhist, having done Nyungne and also prolonged fast for 7 days with just water, then as well as the physical benefits, which are, really significant, the attention I can observe during meditation and the concentration and the awareness that comes from the different senses, that's really the most significant thing of note for me as an individual personally. But I can talk about that if there's any interest in that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'll ask also Dr. Khalsa to join and. So I think so. This was fascinating and stimulating. Thank you to both of you for just providing some insight. So one of the questions I guess I would think to ask, and I'll start with Dr. Ujit, with you first, is that when you think about when you think of something that a healthcare provider should know about fasting, where do you think there is a sort of an opportunity for both academic work in thinking about, this is really a practice that hasn't really been explored, and there's something to it here that you think that the traditions that you've studied or explored here can inform? And then I'll then pose the similar question to Dr. Khalsa.
I think the biggest takeaway would be, because I know fasting is huge in realms of health and weight loss, especially weight loss nowadays. But what's happening, especially in Western society, all over the world, is depression and mental, depression and mental illnesses and so forth. So alongside fasting practices, there's also a popularity in meditation and mental wellness practices that's being borrowed from the so-called Eastern traditions. So given that the Buddhist tradition itself has emphasized the mental benefits, and whether we call that wellness or, intending towards a goal where you transcend the mundane sufferings, because the goal of Buddhism is really to transcend suffering, to eliminate all suffering, then I think there's a way to combine the scientific research, not just on the physical body, but also in terms of mental wellness. I know there's a lot of studies going on right now studying the minds or the brains of long-term meditators, such as the work by Richard Davidson and so forth. I think if we could combine those kind of research, then it could be really fruitful, not only for helping society as it is today and the people within it, but also seeing how these physical and contemplative practices work together to achieve, the traditional as well as the intended modern goals.
And Sathir, since I think I'll just pose sort of a corollary to that question to you, given your recent research on thinking about yoga and anxiety and thinking about, say, like from, you've always, when you talk about yoga, you talk about it as a system, but oftentimes it's researched as the physical practices themselves. And do you think that there is a potential synergy here or synergistic benefit when you combine sort of the fasting practices that we described that are part of some of the yogic traditions? Is there something there that is worth investigating further?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of overlap between the experience of fasting and doing specified diets or mono diets, food restriction. It's similar to the kinds of things that you go through in yoga. I mean, a lot of people don't understand that yoga involves sweating. It's an active process. When you're doing this posture, it's a psychological challenge. Your body is sweating, and you're pushing yourself through to your limits to expand your limits. So there's this whole construct of changing your physiology, changing your resilience. And I think the same experience happens when you do fasting. So really, it's a natural, there's a lot of overlap in the experience between fasting and yoga practices. Fasting itself, it changes you in terms of your perspective on life, because food really is at the core of our biological needs. And so when you start to manipulate that, you start to experience the ranges and extremes of your own capability. And that makes you more capable of tolerating extremes in life, if you will. So in a way, not to go into austerities where you're doing self-flagellation or self-mortification, because that can be damaging, but to push yourself to those limits of yourself makes you stronger, in a sense. And so I see a lot of similarity, and I think the research would be great to be able to study some of these fasting regimens and these mono diets to see how they change not only physiology, but also how they change psychology and even eating behavior. Because when you do a fast, you really come to an understanding of what hunger is and what your relationship is to it. And it changes your patterns after the fast as well. You're not eating the same way. You're eating more frugally. You're eating in a different way. You're much more respectful of the food. You're much more respectable of the kind of food you eat, etc. So I think there's a lot to be learned from research on these fasting regimens.
And I guess the next question then really what I'm particularly struck by is how do you find that fasting or just these are there, to kind of follow up from the earlier thread, are there different fasting regimens for different times or different times of the year or different sort of states of mind? Is that been prescriptive in the textual spaces? Like there are different types of fasts that fall, and somebody needs to prescribe the fast to you. Is that, and so Dr. Ajit, is that something that you've seen in the text, that the wise individual, whoever the wise one, is prescribing the fast?
So this particular practice, the one called Nungne, so it goes back to the 9th century. And the texts say that the woman who kind of was a propagator of the tradition, she was a tantric practitioner, and she received it directly during a meditative vision from the bodhisattva of compassion, who's associated with purification, with compassion. And it's said that she healed her leprosy through carrying out the practice and seeing the benefits of it. Then she passed it on. So then there's commentary literature kind of going into how to do it. So we have a variety of those from Tibet, from Mongolia, from Nepal, over, the centuries. So in there, it's really just avoiding food. So that's not really, gone into too much detail. But for those who are unable to, for various reasons, so there is a version called Nine, and that's just kind of reducing. So that has variations over, the periods. So as with any tantric practice, although this is a lower level tantra, there's 4 levels, and this is known as action tantra, which is a bit more open to practitioners, then there's still the teacher or the instructor who has access to the commentaries. Everyone's told to avoid just taking these practices, looking at the text and doing it themselves. So I think in there, through the oral tradition, there's a lot more detailed instructions in which you can ask, like, what to avoid, what not to, and what to take and what's more beneficial, and so forth. And then in regard to the other practices, again, like, in the Chinese tradition, it's really vegetarianism, so avoiding all meats when fasts are carried out. So there's a whole variety, and I think no study, even in the Buddhist studies discipline, has been carried out to really compare these. So I think if there's the opportunity to do that, as well as look at, the backup through different scientific research, like psychology and so forth, then I think it could be really interesting.
And Satir, how is the prescription of fasting? Is there guidance through this yoga scripture?
Well, I think there is evidence that yoga teachers, yoga masters have given prescriptions to people to say, look, you're going through this particular disease or this symptom. This is what you should do. Do this fast for this period of time. And it's along the lines of also prescribing specific meditations to practice, specific breathing techniques to practice, and specific postures to do. So that is there. And you'll also see it in the texts, in the books that have come out of the different schools, lineages, and traditions of yoga. And sometimes it's actually curious, because one tradition will say, oh, you absolutely must eat this, and the other tradition says, oh, you absolutely have to avoid this. So it's all over the map, and it's a question of which lineage you are following, and what you believe and what you have faith in a sense. One example is, some traditions in yoga say, oh, you definitely can't eat garlic and onions. That's too stimulating. In our yoga tradition, actually, onions and garlic are a staple. You must eat those almost always. So you see a lot of variation, and it's based upon practice and years of history, and who knows what comes out of the wash if you were to take all of these and subject them to scientific experimentation, which ones would come out. But there is a long history of this kind of thing, and even in those texts that I was quoting, those ancient texts, there were sections I did not quote. They have a list of 15 different foods that you should eat and 15 different foods that you should not eat as a regular practice. But the whole idea of prescription is also there as well.
And I think the next question, just for me, is as we move from the individual context to a global context. So both of you talked about a little bit about just like how this is being deployed globally. What are some of the cautions that we should, especially Dr. Dito, I'll start with you first. What are some of the cautions that you think, there's some popularization, there's some sort of cultural appropriation that is happening here as well. And what are some of the cautions societally that we should be aware of as some of these practices are being adopted?
Just quickly, so many of the fasting practices, apart from this lay vow that's taken the basic 8 precepts, which is really in the Southeastern tradition now. So that one is fairly safe because you just do it for one day. It's intermittent, so it's noon to breakfast. So it's fairly safe. But when it comes to the Tibetan tradition, because of the tantric element, these practices are really not meant to be practiced just on a whim. It has to really, go with instructions, with the right meditation practices. And what I didn't get to mention is the very complex visualization practices in which one is kind of, dissolution of the body and then manifesting the body as other beings, and fairly intense visualization that goes with tantric practices. So I think one of the dangers is people getting attracted to it because they see fasting and then be like, okay, well, I want to do this one because it's a form of fasting and it's hip because it's Buddhist and it's a retreat. But without the proper instructions, then the text itself talks about the dangers of misinterpreting and mispracticing and, misunderstanding the instructional texts. So far, what I've observed is the retreats are pretty genuine. They are guided by an instructor or sometimes a Tibetan teacher or someone who's really gone through multiple of these retreats. So obviously I'm not aware of all of them, but the ones that I've seen or been to seem still pretty traditional in comparison to like the texts and the commentaries that I've read from 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. But there is that danger for sure.
Okay. Dr. Khalsa.
Yeah, no, it pretty much resonates the same in the yogic practices and the traditions. I mean, if you read a lot of the books on yoga that address fasting, there's a lot of cautionary statements about exactly how to engage in a fast, when to do it, how to come off of it. And so the danger is that people are going to come to yoga practices with, hey, this is really cool, it's ancient, I'm going to really do it. And they read about fasting water and suddenly they're on a water fast for 10 days without understanding the characteristics of what's going to happen to them. And I saw this whole idea of unguided access to this information and unsupervised practice, I think, can be very dangerous. That applies not just to, obviously, fasting, but it also applies to the breathing practices and the physical postures in yoga as well. I mean, people can really get into this and go to an extreme. So I think if they're not going to be in a tradition with a certified teacher, then they have to be careful.
Wonderful. Well, I have to say this has been an amazing discussion, and part of it for me just it makes me just like again we think about how the science here will hopefully reinform the spiritual practices and sort of how it may be optimized. But I think the other side is just thinking about how do we personalize medicine, right? I mean, this is sort of an aspect of personalized medicine and thinking about what is appropriate for what individual, when, and then the how. And obviously that's it's much more complex than perhaps many people have imagined it to be. And certainly many of the wisdom traditions have described the complexity. It's in great detail, and we have to make sure that we sort of honor that complexity that has been sort of has a space of time and sort of lineage and obviously wisdom that supports it. So what we will do now, so again, thank you to both of you for just really amazing talks and really stimulating, and thank you to our audience for sending in the questions. What we will do now is we're going to transition back into the larger room, and so we'll just close this breakout room and return back to the main room where we'll have our final plenary and then have some concluding thoughts as well. So thank you again, everyone, and we're going to move now back into the larger room. Thank you.
Thank you.